this road that goes through Yorktown and Jamestown, Virginia. There are a lot of lights on the street, so as soon as the sun goes down, it gets pretty dark. On this night, park rangers were notified that there was a car that had almost gone off an embankment. It was kind of teetering off the edge. And so there was a car accident. So the rangers rushed to the scene where they find this car hanging over the embankment, dangling off the edge. There was this area that had super tall, thick brush, and it had stopped the car from going over completely and into the river. So the park rangers make their way down to the car to see if there are any survivors of this accident. But one glance inside the car would tell them this was no car accident. The passengers, both of whom were women, were dead. Their throats had been cut. One was laying in the back seat, and the other was in the hatchback. And the FBI was called in right away. So, FBI agents start processing the scene. They are gathering evidence, taking photos, and eventually they remove the car from the ledge and begin to process it. 2 IDs were found inside the car belonging to the victims, so they were able to ID them right away. One was 27-year-old Kathleen Thomas, and the other was 21-year-old Rebecca Ann Dowski. The car, which was a 1980 Honda Civic, was registered to Kathleen. Now, the crime scene was hard to process. The car was hard to process because it had essentially been kind of shaken, if you can think of a crime scene being shaken, had been tipped upside down. Everything was just a mess. The keys to the car were found inside. There was this church flyer inside the car, a Carly Simon album, a blue blazer still on a hanger, a gym bag and shorts stained with blood, along with a cardboard. There was nothing found inside the car that would lead police to any kind of suspect. In the meantime, the bodies of the women were taken in for an autopsy. It was discovered that their bodies had actually been doused in diesel fuel, and there were also matches found inside the car that had been struck. So it seemed like someone had tried to douse them with gas and light the car on fire. But diesel fuel doesn't ignite the same way gasoline does. The medical examiner determined that the women had been dead for at least 24 hours. Both women had partially digested food in their stomachs, so they had likely eaten about a half hour to an hour before they were killed. While initially it scars, like in the webbing of her fingers, but that was it. So police were kind of stumped. Who had been able to overtake two women without them putting up a fight? Both of these women were dressed, and there were no signs of sexual assault. And there were also no signs of robbery as a motive because there was cash in the car. Okay, let's talk about Kathleen and Rebecca for a minute. Both women were in the United States Naval Academy class of 1981. And as it would turn out, they were not just friends, they were in a relationship. And this relationship was pretty new. Kathy's family was very accepting of her sexuality, but it was the 80s, so she kind of kept this a secret from everyone else. So these women had kept their relationship pretty quiet. Rebecca's family, on the other hand, had no idea that she was in a relationship with a woman. She had actually been in a previous relationship, like a serious long-term relationship with a man, before she had begun dating Kathy. And she had never talked to anyone in her family about dating a woman or the fact that she was gay or bisexual. So, apparently, in order for these two women to keep their relationship quiet, they would drive out to this secluded spot along the Colonial Parkway and park. On the night of October 9th, the women pulled over along this lover's lane near the river. Someone came up to the car and somehow, without there being any kind of a struggle, overpowered the women, and their bodies were found a few days later. The investigation began with agents trying to create a timeline. They knew Kathy and Rebecca had been seen together on October 9th on the Williams and Mary campus, where Rebecca lived in the dorms. Rebecca was using a computer. Kathy was just kind of hanging out. And then around 6:30, they got investigators realized was that most boats run on diesel fuel. Some trucks do, but gasoline is much more common. This information, coupled with the nylon rope that was likely used to strangle them, made police kind of start theorizing that perhaps, like a fisherman or someone with a boat, had been responsible. It was also initially believed that Rebecca and Kathleen knew their killer. The investigators started looking at people who had previously been in relationships with the women. One of Kathy's ex-girlfriends was looked at closely because she had actually introduced the two of them. And Rebecca's ex-boyfriend was also looked into, but they were all cleared. Investigators found that there had been several complaints against a male park ranger who had been stopping women in the area and then making inappropriate comments to them. And so they began to think maybe it was this park ranger. And there were some clues that supported this, like the driver's side window had been rolled down. Like if you were to get pulled over, you would roll your window down. And also, her driver's license was out. So maybe she had rolled down her window and been asked for ID. However, the park ranger in question was never charged. He was questioned. He was given a polygraph, which he passed, and he was ruled out. Another theory was that it wasn't necessarily a park ranger, but someone impersonating a park ranger or a police officer. Several suspects were looked into, but no arrests were made. And because of the information the profiler had come up with, agents were keeping their eye out for anyone who worked around boats, but this would just kind of end up being a dead end, and the case would go cold. A year later, in September of 1987, 20-year-old David Navely and 14-year-old Robin Edwards stop at another Lover's Lane area along Colonial Parkway, just 20 miles south of where Kathy and Rebecca were killed. So, a 20-year-old and a 14-year-old parked at a Lover's Lane is definitely not something we hear about nowadays. And even in the 80s, I think this was pretty taboo. Robin did not start the night off with him. So Robin had been planning on going on a date with David's younger cousin named Jason. And originally, our mom was going to take them to a movie, but then she got sick, and so she asked David if he would drive Jason and Robin on their little date. But he only had this little 2-seater truck, and he was just planning on having the two of them ride in the bed of the truck. But it was raining, and so Robin ended up in front with David. We don't know exactly what happened, but they must have hit it off. They were talking, so they ended up deciding to meet up later that night. So Robin being abused by a 20-year-old man. So Robin's dad is the one who wakes up and finds his daughter missing, and he just figures this is Robin being Robin. But her mom is more concerned because usually when Robin would run away, there was a catalyst. They had told her no, they were trying to give her boundaries or rules, or there had been some kind of fight, but the night before, none of those things had happened. So, when Robin doesn't return the next day, they call police, and they basically said, look, call us if she doesn't turn up in a day or two. So a few days later, Robin's mom goes in to the police station to report her daughter missing. A few days later, the truck was found. The truck was discovered by a ranger who noticed that it had an open door, and the windshield wipers were like going even though it wasn't raining. So the ranger approaches the truck, and like I said, the doors open. He sees the keys still in the ignition. The car was on. The wipers are going. The radio's on. And inside the truck there are 2 pairs of shoes and a few pieces of clothing, as well as a wallet. There's no one around, no one inside. The truck was registered to David, so rangers call his house, and they're trying to figure out where he is and how his car ended up on the side of the road. So his mom and his sister go out there to get the truck and kind of see what's going on for themselves. David's mom was super confused. Now, she hadn't seen her son for a few days, and he's 20. This isn't uncommon, but his truck was his baby, and no scenario made sense in which he would just leave his truck with the keys in it, parked on the side of the road. David's mom ends up calling David's dad to tell him what was going on, but the police are not concerned. They do not suspect foul play. They basically just wanted the family to take the truck home, so they did. David's dad felt like something was wrong, though. I guess his reasoning was there are shoes and clothes found inside the truck, and one of the pairs of shoes was women's shoes. So I guess police's theory was that David and this woman had ended up going skinny dipping, but if they had, why hadn't they come back? So David's dad decides to go out and search the river for himself, thinking maybe they got hurt, maybe they drowned. Like, it just doesn't make sense that they decided to go skinny dipping and never came back, and that's okay with the police. So he searched the river, but he found nothing. Now, David's truck was not considered a crime scene. Police had kind of looked around inside of it, and then they had let the family take it home. They had noted that there were 2 pairs of shoes. So, the next day, when this missing teenage girl's report comes across their desk, and they begin reading the description of what she was wearing, they remember those shoes. It's like an exact match of the shoes in that truck. And this is when they realize something's wrong here. This is more than just some kids who went skinny dipping and then maybe like left in someone else's car. said David's dad has already taken the truck home. So, by the time police are putting this together, they realize they need to go officially search the truck. They also begin an official search for David and Robin in the area the truck was found. And around the same time, a man stumbles across this pile of clothes near the river, or what looked like a pile of clothes, but as he got closer, he realized it was actually a body. It was a young girl lying face down. Her pants were unbuttoned, and her shirt was pulled up, and there was a bullet wound to the back of her head. David's body was also found, lying about 40 feet away, also dead. He was only wearing pants, and he had also been shot in the back of the head and also in the shoulder. Now these bodies are discovered, and police, who have really messed up at this point, they didn't believe there was any foul play. The family's been in the truck, like no crime scene was secured. Doesn't even tell the families about the bodies being found. They heard about it on the evening news, where photos from the crime scene were shown to the public alongside the story. Police began working on a theory of what had happened that night. They believed that Robin had been killed first, and David had tried to make a run for it, but the killer had shot him in the shoulder, which stopped him, or at least slowed him down until the killer could catch up with him, and then shot him execution style in the back of the head. An autopsy would later reveal that Robin had intercourse shortly before her death. Her body had been in the water, so it was bloated, and also because of this, all physical evidence was pretty much lost. Something that really baffled state police about this had to do with the shoes and the location of the victims' bodies. First of all, it was a fall night in Virginia. It would have been relatively cool when they were killed. But they have this theory that the couple had decided to go skinny dipping. But why would they have wanted to go skinny dipping when the water was so cold? And let's say they didn't care about the frigid water temperatures. Why hadn't they worn their shoes as they walked down to the river? It was like a pretty rocky, not like super treacherous, but it wasn't just like a sandy beach shot down to the river. So why had they decided to walk down to the river barefoot? Police found out that shortly before the murders, there was this local drug dealer who had ended up at a party that Robin had been at, and he was really coming on strong to Robin, but she had shut it down. She was not interested, and when she turned him down, he was furious. So there's this theory that she called him that night to try to maybe score some weed from him, and he shows up to the scene, and because she had turned him down and then called him while she was with another man, he got angry and killed them both. So police really look into this theory. There's really nothing that ties him directly to the crime. Now, I don't know if this is a coincidence coincidence or not, and you guys know how I feel about coincidences in true crime, but they began questioning people around this man, and they bring in one of his associates. They bring him in once, they bring him in twice, and they go to bring him in a third time. But he had been killed. He had been hit by a train, which I don't know if they ever technically said he was murdered. But that's pretty suspicious. So while they never had a lot of evidence to tie this drug dealer to the double homicide, the death of his associate is super suspicious, but after he dies, so does this lead. Now, another theory or another suspect police had was actually a tipster who called in saying that he saw David and Robin get out of David's truck on the night they were killed, leave the door open, and walk down to the water. He said he was also in that area, and then shortly after this, he heard gunshots, so he booked it out of there. The tipster quickly became a suspect because of several inconsistencies in his story. But again, police really have nothing to tie him to this case, and this suspect ends up dying soon after as well. While this double homicide along Colonial Parkway is in no way being tied to the double homicide along Colonial Parkway just 1 year earlier, there are some similarities, and David's family is actually kind of the ones who, they don't point out the similarities, but they come up with this theory that perhaps David had been pulled over by someone who was impersonating a police officer, and he got out of the car on this police officer's command with no shoes, and then he and Robin were kind of marched down to the river and shot. But again, investigators don't have a ton of evidence to suggest this, although the driver's side window was rolled down, as if perhaps David had rolled it down to talk to someone outside the car. And just like the murder of Kathleen and Rebecca, soon Robin and David's murders had gone cold. But it didn't take long for investigators to start connecting these two murders. Now, they were two very different crimes. In one case, we have women being strangled, and then their necks being sliced. And the next one, we have two people being shot. However, these crimes took place in these secluded Lover's Lane type areas. Both couples had been in a car, and FBI profiler John Kelly was beginning to believe that they had a serial killer on their hands, one with some jealous rage inside him. He either can't have a relationship for whatever reason, or maybe he's in a very unfulfilling relationship. Either way, their killer comes across these lovers, and something inside him snaps, and he kills them. The problem is, while there are a lot of similarities between these two murders, there are also a lot of differences. The method of killing them is different. So there could be just two separate killers responsible, but more than likely, investigators believe their killer is just evolving, and he would strike again stop. That would be weird. He just goes home. The next morning, around 7 a.m., Keith's dad is actually on his way to work, again driving along Colonial Parkway, when he spots his son's car pulled off on the side of the road. He pulls over to see what's going on, and he notices a couple things. The driver's side door is wide open. The glove compartment is open, and the keys are in the ignition, but Keith is nowhere to be found. His dad also noticed that the front seat of the car was pushed forward, like either someone had pushed it forward to get in the back seat, or someone much shorter had driven the car, in a move that he would regret for the rest of his life. Keith's dad just kind of shakes it off and heads to work. And he figures whatever happened, Keith will show up eventually. 2 hours later, a park ranger would report the car abandoned. They run the plates and place a call to the call home, and Keith's mother hears that her son's car is abandoned on the side of the road. Now, this is the first time she's getting this information, even though his brother and his father have actually passed the car in the last 12 hours. His mother and sister show up to get the car because they don't want police to tow it. And police are looking through it. Inside, there were some items of clothing that belonged to Keith and Cassandra. Keith's glasses, his watch, his underwear are all found in the back seat, along with Cassandra's bra, wallet, and one of her shoes. Now, probably the most mysterious thing about these items being found in the back of the car is Keith's father was insistent that they had not been in the back of the car at 7 a.m. that morning when he saw it. He had looked through the car. He would have been more alarmed had his son's glasses and shoes and underwear been in the back. So he says those items were placed there after he stopped. Again, the working theory is that the couple had decided to go skinny dipping, but it was a pretty cold night. The river was searched for their bodies. They were thinking that the missing couple had decided to go skinny dipping, maybe drowned or had hypothermia. But here's the thing. The temperature would have been about 40 degrees. It would have been too cold to go for a swim. Nothing was really adding up here, but police were searching for Keith and Cassandra, and soon the family joined in. Canines were brought in to try and track Cassandra and Keith, and I guess several sets of dogs were brought in, and they all went directly from the car straight to the water. So police really concentrated their search efforts on the water, but they couldn't find any trace of them. They did believe that if the bodies were in the river, they would surface within a few days. And a few days later, a body was recovered, but it wasn't Keith or Sandy. It was an older man who had fallen off his boat and died a few days earlier. So this massive search of the water was done, but nothing was ever found. No trace of them, no footprints, no articles of clothing, nothing. Despite several very thorough searches, was dating a man named Clint, who was Daniel's older brother. Anna was just kind of hitching a ride with him to the beach. She wanted to go see her family. They were all from the area. It was just like a quick overnight trip. So Daniel is actually in the process of moving in with Anna and Clint. So he is like doing this thing where he loads up his stuff, he drives it, unpacks. The next day he drives back, gets more of his stuff. So this is kind of the situation, and Anna decides she wants to go visit her family. So she hitches a ride home with him. He packs up the rest of his stuff. Anna spends time with her family. She actually shares with her sister some exciting news that her and Clint are talking about getting married. And then the next day, Daniel picks Anna up and they load into his Chevy Nova around 11 p.m. And this is on September 4th. It should have taken them only a few hours to get back, but they never arrived. Clint, now this is back before cell phones. When they don't arrive, Clint calls his parents to see if maybe they got held up, maybe they forgot something and went back, but they hadn't seen Anna or Daniel since the previous night. So a missing persons report was filed right away. Anna's mom, who had not heard from Anna, had also called police and filed a report. Around the same time as these police reports are being filed, Daniel's car was discovered abandoned along the trucking side of a westbound rest stop on Colonial Parkway. So the car was found on the west side, like heading west, but they had been heading east. The car was on this acceleration ramp, half kind of on the road, half off. The keys were still in the ignition, and the driver's side window was rolled halfway down. All of Anna and Daniel's belongings were found in the car, except for one thing. Before Daniel had left, his mother had given him this woolen blanket, and this was not found in the car. Anna had this roach clip with a feather on it that she took everywhere, and it was found hanging on the window, almost like someone had placed it there. A search was launched for Anna and Dan, and canines were brought in immediately. But 6 weeks went by, and there was just nothing. But then, 2 hunters were out near an old logging road, which was about 3 miles from the rest stop, when they stumbled upon the remains of Daniel and Anna. Their bodies were actually covered with that missing blanket from the car. A forensic team processed the scene. They found blood spatter and some of Anna's fingernails. There were signs that the murder had taken place along this logging road. So weeds that were found on the undercarriage of Dan's car when it had been found matched vegetation in the area of the murder site, which suggested to police that the killer had used the car to drive deep into the woods, dump the body, and then abandon it back on the rest stop. So at least one of their questions was answered, because a big question had always been, why was the car facing west, like it had pulled over going west? So the bodies were in a pretty advanced state of decomposition by the time they were found. Dan's remains were too decomposed for the medical examiner to determine a cause of death. shoes inside of it. It was found 100 feet away from the bodies, but the chain that belonged with this locket was never found. And like the others, this case is still unsolved. Now, these cases have never all been linked together, but there are so many similarities, it's hard not to come to that conclusion. After Anna and Dan's murder, the Colonial Parkway predator seemed to just kind of stop. Or did he? Because 10 years later in Virginia, actually in Shenandoah Park, 2 women would be murdered, and their murders were immediately linked to those of Rebecca and Kathleen. Now, the Shenandoah murder case remains unsolved to this day, although in that case, police did come up with some really good suspects, one of whom police are fairly certain is the Colonial Parkway predator.